This is Random Thoughts, and in today's video we are going to look at the story of Siad Barre. And the story of Siad Barre is a story of a hero who stays around too long and gradually turns into a villain. General Siad Barre is the greatest leader Somalia has ever had. And most development that Somalia has had ever was during the reign of General Siad Barre. Schools, roads, and all that. Before and after him, not much has happened, to be honest. As it is the case with many nations, the dream of a better reality always intrudes, and Somalia was not any different. At some point, the people of Somalia thought that Siad Barre had stayed around for too long, and they were not seeing anything good in him, and they thought that maybe they deserved something better. Of course, people always deserve something better. But the pursuit of that dream led to the downfall of a great nation state, which in the 1960s and 70s used to often be referred to as the Switzerland of Africa. That's how highly Somalia was thought of. And over that year, since the end of the reign of Siad Barre, Somalia has struggled to stand again and take its place among the great nations of Africa. In the last years of Siad Barre, many citizens thought of him as the only problem that the nation faced, and they thought that by getting rid of him, they were going to herald at the beginning of the most peaceful and prosperous era. They were wrong, though. They trusted the words of his opponents without interrogating their own interests, their own character, and their actions or intentions. In fact, when Siad Barre fled from Mogadishu on the 27th January 1991, there were celebrations in Mogadishu and across the nation. It was like, at long last, the problem is gone. Now we are going to build a better nation, and we are going to be this great nation again after getting rid of the problem that has been with us for a very long time. But that celebration was short-lived. It quickly became clear that those who had spearheaded the removal of Siad Barre, they themselves were only interested in one thing, and that is being in power. And because of that, they almost immediately started fighting amongst themselves as to who was going to be the president or who was going to hold what position. But let's look at the backstory. Siad Barre was born, could be 1910 or a little bit earlier or sometime after that. Nobody knows for sure the year he was born, but it is generally taken that he was born in 1910. He was not born in Somalia, though. He was born in Ethiopia, and his family lived there. He belonged to a sub-clan known as the Marehan clan that is part of the larger Darud clan. He went to Somalia as a young boy, and he started schooling there, his primary school and secondary school. There is no information about him going to university, but he did join the police. He went to study in Italy. It is important to point out that Siad Barre seems like was a widely read man. He did read a lot, going by how he presented himself, his ideas, and he spoke fluently 3 languages, that is Somali, English, and Italian. And then he also spoke some other languages, in particular some Swahili and some Arabic. Now, after joining the police force or the police service, he did rise to the position or the post of chief inspector. And then in the 1950s, he went to a military academy in Italy, even though he was a police officer. That was because there was no military in Somalia, so it was just the police, and the police kind of like performed some functions of the military. He went to Italy. He came back at the time when Somalia was gaining its independence in the 1960s, and he came back and he went directly and he became part of the newly formed National Army. And in 1965, he was a commander-in-chief, and also he became a major general. Somalia became a democracy immediately after gaining independence, and its first president was elected, and then there was elections that were held in 1967, the second elections, and that president was defeated. In fact, he just led the guy who won to become the next president, which was very unique in Africa during this time. Most countries did not have that. So the second president was Abdirashid Ali Shamarke, who was elected in 1967. 2 years after his election, the state was on the verge of collapsing. Shamarke was gunned down by one of his bodyguards in what has often been described as a personal issue that existed between the two. Now, after being gunned down, there was, of course, some form of vacuum, and it seemed like the country was not going in the right direction. And Siad Barre stepped in through a bloodless coup to save the state from potential ruin. Many people celebrated this coup, not only because it was saving the state from a constitutional crisis, but also because the previous two governments, even though democratically elected, had been accused to be corrupt, ineffective, and inefficient. So the people thought that maybe the military taking power was a good thing. And Siad Barre became the president that way. And from 1969 to 1978, he was very popular in Somalia. He was a very popular president. And that popularity was driven even further by him deciding to support the people of Ogaden, the Somalis of Ogaden, who were fighting to become independent of Ethiopia, and they basically wanted to join Somalia and become part of Somalia. And remember, he was born in that region, so you can see how it was so personal to him anyways. And because of that, he became even popular, and he did have a lot of victories initially, a lot of success, and that made him a hero at home, of course. But a year later, things changed drastically, and that's because the Soviet Union, which all along had been on the side of Somalia, decided to change position, and it became an ally of Ethiopia. And because of that, Somalia could not sustain the war, and Ethiopia basically won the war, even though the rebellion in the Ogaden region continued for many years later. But the failure of Siad Barre to stamp his authority in Ogaden, or to take Ogaden and make it part of Somalia, became the beginning of his actual problems. Many military officers thought that he did not handle the war properly or in the right way, maybe because he didn't manage the diplomatic side of the war appropriately, and that's how the Soviet Union decided to shift and become allies of Ethiopia. And he faced open rebellion from officers in the military, and he decided to face the rebellion with force. And in fact, he did have close to 100 of the top military officers executed because of expressing their dissatisfaction with his leadership. And not long after, he faced a military coup, which was unsuccessful. That was in 1978. And throughout the 1980s, there rose different groups that were basically trying to fight Siad Barre and remove him from power. And most of these groups were clan-based, but the most notable one, at least initially, was one that was known as the Somali National Movement. This group put a lot of pressure on Siad Barre, and because of this pressure, of course, Siad Barre became even more ruthless because he needed to stamp his authority, and sometimes he went overboard with his actions. Now, this group, SNM, was primarily based in Ethiopia, and at some point, Siad Barre managed to have to sign a treaty with Ethiopia. And that, of course, denied any groups that were fighting him a place to operate from in Ethiopia. And SNM decided to come back, and they did make some raids. The tactics the SNM used, we can say, were also very dirty, even though Siad Barre himself was ruthless. They also did some things that put Siad Barre in a very difficult position. For example, launching attacks on major towns and then just joining civilians, sometimes dressed in civilian clothes or heavily dressed in civilian clothes, which was basically inviting the military to attack civilians. Many deaths occurred, and that, of course, painted Siad Barre in a very negative way, which we could argue that that was the goal of this group from the word go. But the group that became very effective at fighting Siad Barre was the United Somali Congress. Now, this one was formed in the late 80s, and it comprised mostly politicians who had been in his government, members of parliament, and also members of the military, including Farah Aidid. Mohamed Farah Aidid is a well-known figure in that group. They formed it. Mohamed Farah Aidid, in fact, was an army general. At some point, he was an aide-de-camp to Siad Barre, which is very interesting. And then he was posted to India as an ambassador. And it's from there that he resigns and he comes back to Somalia to join the United Somali Congress alongside Ali Mahdi. Now, Ali Mahdi is the guy who almost immediately after the removal of Siad Barre was declared to be the next president, but that did not make Mohamed Farah Aidid happy because he himself wanted to be the next president, and that created a huge rift within the group, and that's the beginning of the civil war that went on in Somalia for a very long time. So what actually led to the fall of Siad Barre? Of course, Siad Barre, he wasn't a perfect leader like most leaders. We can say all leaders are not perfect. Of course, they are human and they make mistakes. But what specifically made Siad Barre so disliked in Somalia that he ended up being removed? There were many things that happened. And of course, one of the things that happened is that the nature of politics in Somalia was already poisoned, even before he became president, even before Somalia became independent. This could be through the actions and policies of the colonizers, in particular the Italians and the British and the French, in that these colonizers, like it is the case in the rest of Africa, had come to realize that the best way to rule over Africans was to divide them, to divide and rule, of course. In the rest of Africa, of course, the divide and rule worked in terms of tribes. In Somalia, being almost the same tribe, they resorted to playing the clans. And by the time the Italians and the British and the French are leaving, the politics had become so clan-based that, so before even Siad Barre comes into the scene, there was already a structure in place that was going to lead to his downfall. Initially, Siad Barre had put in place mechanism to try to fight off or to remove this structure of clanism in the politics of Somalia. But at some point, he realized that he could not fight it, and he kind of like joined it because he started practicing it himself. He started trusting more people of his clan than others. So we can say the clanism thing played against him, because now other clans started ganging up, not exactly against Siad Barre, but against his own clan. And so that played a part, because even the groups that formed to fight him were basically clan-based. And also nepotism. At some point, he even appointed his own son to be chief of staff. There's also paranoia. Siad Barre, the more opposition he got, the more paranoid he seemed to have gotten. And this paranoia led to having people detained without trial, including top civil servants, politicians, religious leaders. Anybody he felt like was doing something that in the end was going to compromise his authority, he would just have them detained. And that, of course, made people to be even more against him. Something else that might have contributed to his downfall is his attempts to reshape the Somali society. And this reshaping came in several ways. One of those was trying to bring in the ideas, the revolutionary ideas, like socialism, scientific socialism. Of course, and he also tried to bring in new family laws. And Somali society has always been a very conservative society, and trying to bring in very radical ideas might make people a little bit uncomfortable. And unfortunately, Siad Barre did that. Of course, his intentions were good, but of course, he was facing a society that was very conservative, and maybe he thought maybe he can change that society into something else. And by so doing, he did step on toes. Also, him falling out with the Soviets, as I've mentioned, while fighting the Ethiopians. The Soviets were on his side at one point, and then they shifted, and that, of course, changed the outcome of the war. And 1991, 1990, of course, in 1989, the Soviet Union falls and the Cold War is over. And most African leaders depended on that Cold War to get support, either from the West or the East. If you wanted money from the Soviets, you will tell them, I've abandoned the West, I'm now with you guys. If you want the money from the West or support or military support, you will tell them, I've abandoned East, now I'm the West. But now with the end of the Cold War, that game could not be played. And Siad Barre, of course, was one of those African leaders who played that game. And at that point, he could not run to anyone for support. And of course, there was the point of younger Somali citizens wanting to grab power. The likes of Farah Aidid. Of course, they were so ambitious. Farah Aidid in particular was so ambitious. Seems like he was a very ambitious young man then. Not very young, but he was young. So that also contributed to the fall of Siad Barre. But Siad Barre did leave a legacy, and the legacy he leaves behind, or he left behind, is modernizing Somalia. As I've said, there is no other leader who has done as much for Somalia as Siad Barre did. Not before him, not after him. The roads, the schools, the hospitals, it is him. So he also even promoted a lot of literacy in Somalia. He even introduced a new alphabet for the Somali Somali language, which is used widely, I think, and that's his legacy. He also attempted to unite the wider Somali nation. Nobody has tried that in a very long time, not even before the Europeans came along. He tried to bring in the Somalis in Ethiopia and some extent Somalis in Kenya and those in Djibouti and other parts. He tried to bring them together into one big nation state. So that forms part of his legacy. Those are my random thoughts.